We have on our panel John White, the Louisiana State Department of Education, who was the head of the Recovery School District. Kira Orange-Jones. Kira runs Teach for America in New Orleans, but is also on the Board of Elementary and Secondary Education. Andre Perry, who for some reason told me he's doing stuff in Michigan, but I don't believe him because he ran 4 charter schools in New Orleans, is an old friend of mine. And Rosylin York. Rosylin York is just a parent in New Orleans who has been able to navigate this system and has had 5 kids go through the system. There's one other person on this panel who's not listed, and she was backstage with us. That's Victoria York. Victoria was there with her mother, and she was so much more interesting than the rest of us. I said, find her a microphone, we're putting her on. She's a... What was the name? What did you do in 5th grade?
I joined Kids Rethink.
Rethink, which was for the kids pushing for the new form of education. She went through the system after Katrina, now on scholarship at Brandeis studying chemistry. So thank you for joining us unprepared. But I'm going to start with John. John, people keep talking about this being a system of charters. Somehow the notion of it just being charters misses the key elements of what the reforms have been. Explain other things besides the empowerment of the schools.
I do think that in the national discussion of New Orleans, we get a lot wrong because there's a lot of misconceptions. I think there's 2 critical ideas, and they're very simple ways that this system operates. And it's choice, and it's about governance. And I will say that choice, the parent's ability to choose the school that's right for the child, and governance, the role of government and who governs individual schools, is different in our system. We have a system where the vast majority of schools participate in an enrollment process that has no geographic boundaries, where families are able to use one form across the city to choose any public school of their choice, be it high school or an elementary school. And while they may receive some preference in their choice for having a sibling in the school or for the school being located close to where they live, if you live on the West Bank, you can choose a school at Orleans East. If you live in the 7th Ward, you can choose a school uptown. These are choices that weren't available in a system that was geographically zoned. And all of those schools are governed as charter schools, or the vast majority of them are governed as charter schools, which I think in the national context has kind of gives them some political connotation, but I actually think it's not a political issue so much as it is a technical one. A charter school is just a school that, rather than an elected school board overseeing them, a community set of volunteers oversees them, and where 98 cents on the dollar skips the school board and goes right to the principal's doorstep. And so you have a system where schools individually compete for the services, compete to provide the services of families who can choose any school in the city, and where principals and the educators and the community volunteers who oversee those schools have the money and the decision-making authority to do what's right for those kids.
So in other words, if the schools compete, they're like a Safeway competing with a Winn-Dixie or something. One stays open later, the other might have to stay open later to see if they can serve students better.
Yeah, schools should do different things to serve the interests of different constituents. At the same time, schools should be empowered to make decisions on behalf of those people. And when you have a system where 98 cents on the dollar goes right to the principal's doorstep that truly trusts the principal to make decisions on behalf of the kids and trust the parents to make decisions on behalf of the kids that they love, I think you have a system that's much more dynamic and responsive to the needs of the citizenry, and that's the basic theory.
But what happens if a principal messes up?
Well, that school has to exist on a contract, and we do have to be willing to draw the line, and it's happened. I would actually say the New Orleans system, because schools exist on a contract with the state, has been more responsive to gross mismanagement.
So in other words, shutting down bad schools.
Shutting down bad schools, intervening whatever it takes to stop bad activity, because you have a legal vehicle for doing that, and that legal vehicle is a contract with every single board of every single school, and the terms of that contract that allow the government to step in and say, you've crossed a line and we're done.
Well, can you shut down a school because the kids aren't doing as well on tests?
You can do that, but I think we're at a point now where we all understand that we never want to get to that place again. And no system should want to get to that place again. There are times where you have gross mismanagement on the part, and this exists in many urban systems across the country, where you have to step in and say something is wrong here. And there are times Recently, we had a school that was not doing what it needed to do under the law to protect the civil rights of students with disabilities, and we did have to intervene and say, we don't trust you any longer
Actually, you
to
took
run
the
this
school
school.
in my old neighborhood, Broadmoor, the Andrew Wilson School. It had a local charter. It wasn't doing well. The test scores weren't good, and you revoked the charter. I remember my brother, who was part of that board, called me in to pull strings, and I looked at the scores. I said, you can't pull strings anymore. Y'all didn't shape up fast enough.
Well, that's certainly part of, by the way, I'm very glad you didn't try to pull my strings.
First time I ever told you
Putting
about
all
my
that
brother
aside, we should have had
out.
this conversation back in the green room. But anyways, that all being what it is. Yes, I mean, it's true. There comes a point. And look, if you can criticize that and you can say that it's a problematic process and so on, but the fact of it is, in low-income communities, in communities predominantly of color, over time, school boards have erred on the side of stasis rather than on the side of action. That has not served the people of our country and our cities in particular well, and this is a system that is responsive to that situation.
Kira, what's it like being a teacher in such a system?
So, as someone who was also a teacher in Louisiana years before this moment in time, and now having the opportunity to support and hear the perspectives of countless teachers across the system, I think a couple things feel markedly different. Prior to, I would say even it's not just the last 10 years. I think some people sort of mark that as this moment in time, but what we have to remember is there were teachers and leaders who were doing incredibly important work, entrepreneurial work, working on behalf of their students well before the last 10 years, and sometimes that part of the story is often really forgotten, and it's actually really important. But when I think about what it meant to be a teacher in Louisiana almost now 15 years ago, there were many challenges that I experienced as a classroom teacher in trying to create examples that my students and our families could point to that actually proved it was possible in our state to go to a high school that would put you on a path for college or career, right? And I remember spending a lot of time with my principal trying to find examples of where to actually send my students for middle school and high school that would actually put them on a path, that would unequivocally put them on a path. And that was actually very challenging to do. When I think about what it means to be a teacher today, what I often hear from many of the teachers that I have the opportunity to work most closely with, and in particular not just our teachers but our school leaders, is a lot more freedom to actually figure out what is best for students at the level that's closest, which is closest to students, right? So there's a lot more, we use the word autonomy, but what that really means in practice is just a lot more decision-making that can happen closest to where students are, and a lot less red tape and bureaucracy from places like, whether it be the state board or the district that's sort of pushing down systems that ultimately impact teachers. And I think that frees up teachers to make decisions that are best for students, and also, frankly, to have a heightened degree of frankly, ownership and accountability for what actually happens in the classroom and at the school level.
Mm-hmm. One of the criticisms, Kira, has been that younger, inexperienced, and whiter teachers have come in to replace some of the veteran teachers. What percentage are teachers of color, and how do you think that's working?
Yeah, so today our overall system has, I want to say about 55% of all teachers are teachers of color. The majority of school leaders across our system are also school leaders of color as well.
And the majority of people on the charter boards are people of color,
That's
right?
true as well. And again, I think this speaks to what I was just saying. I think part of the narrative that everything happened in the last 10 years doesn't give real credence to and respect to the leaders, many of whom were veteran educators, who played such a critical role in shepherding in many of the changes that have been really positive for our children. And so we have to make sure that we're not telling a narrative that somehow puts poles against each other, but one that is much more of a continuum that actually recognizes the progress of many different educators across time and how they've worked together to create better opportunities.
I saw Doc Jones, I don't know if he's here, he must be, wave Doc if you're here, who works with you. There you are. I say, there you are there, and nice suit. But you formed a partnership with him to make sure that you could reach out to the community. How does that go in terms of community relations when you're bringing in a new type of teachers in schools?
Yeah, I mean, I would just say that I think, especially in the last several years, I have seen much more much more progress on behalf of individual schools and charters to try to figure out right ways to engage our community. There's no way that schools should operate in a vacuum and not actually be deeply rooted in the broader context that our students live in and our parents live in. And I'm seeing many examples across our city now of where schools are really working much harder to do that well. And a lot of what I've focused on the last 4 years has been helping both both leaders who actually may not be from here, but actually have good intentions, basically figure out ways that they can bridge more effectively within their communities.
Andre, you've been a critic at times, and a couple of your criticisms actually every other hour.
Yeah,
You're somebody who's always got something interesting to say, and you were critical, if I remember correctly, of two things. One, the expulsion policy, which is if you're in one of these types of schools, you have an incentive to expel the bad kids so that your scores go up and you don't have to deal with it. And you want to deal with that, and then there was the other criticism you had.
Special needs is another.
Yeah, the special education, but start with the expulsion issue.
And the way I explain it is that the development of what we have in New Orleans occurred generally in 3 stages. The immediate aftermath, that was a situation where we were literally pulling schools together, cleaning them up, finding teachers. Then you have a second phase, and this is where a heap of criticism is deserved. It was at the point when we got large grants, Teach for America, New Schools for New Orleans, New Leaders for New Schools, and the focus was clearly on deconstructing a former system, right? And in that process, people were expelled, and we can talk to the Youth Empowerment Project, Families and Friends for Incarcerated Children, and all these, and the data bears it out. Right around 2007, the expulsion rate was about the same as what it was pre-Katrina. And then there's this third phase, and to the credit of John and his team and Patrick Dobard, there were a lot of corrections that were done. The RSD and New Orleans education, the way it looks now, is different than it was 3 years ago.
So in other words, the Recovery School District has addressed, to your mind, the expulsion problem?
I'm not satisfied. However, there was a recognition that there was a problem, and prior to that, I don't think so. You saw the lawsuits, Southern Poverty Law Center. You heard from the media.
So what got done?
I mean, to a certain extent, leadership. And I say
But,
this,
I mean,
and I do not dish out.
How did the specific expulsion issue, and I'll ask John as well, how was that addressed?
One, they came up with a common expulsion suspension policy. It's true with the special needs situation. If there's anything innovative about New Orleans, it's not charter schools. It's the ability to balance centralization and decentralization, meaning clearly after the storm we had charter schools and special needs people were falling through the cracks. That is a fact. And if I can have an aside, if there's any moment in time where we have to be painfully and brutally honest, it's this week. Too much of our conversation is coming from external pressure from all over the country, forcing us to tell a narrative that is either all good or all bad. That has to stop.
Yeah. So that's why I'm calling on you. The
point is, John White, Patrick Dobard, and several other charter leaders, as well as community groups in a litigious environment, pull people together to say we have got to address suspension and expulsion. We've got to address special needs services. We're going to differentiate finances for special needs kids. These are the lessons the rest of the country can take. If they go in, and this is what people say all across the country, we need a storm. We need a Hurricane Katrina, which is the most ridiculous thing I ever... But what we are learning is you can't just decentralize things. Yeah. You need centralized factors that address special needs population, and that's what I think leadership brought to the table, and I'll give that credit.
Okay, let me real quickly drill down on the wonky and then let John talk about. So what do you think that they did, or you all did, because you said you were part of the community pressure, to satisfy first the special needs thing? How did that get fixed, or is it halfway fixed?
Well, part of that is the enrollment, the one app process, the common enrollment process.
So
because
schools
it set the
can't
rules,
skim the cream. They can't discriminate.
Not just creaming. You had to go through an application process that's centralized that would put your child based on an algorithm. There are issues with it, but then it takes that responsibility out of the hands of the schools who weren't necessarily incentivized not to take them, but there clearly wasn't incentivized to take them. And so you need to remove that responsibility out of the hand. And that
got done.
And that got done.
What about expulsions?
Well, the expulsion, that was about the school leaders coming together and coming up with a common suspension and
so each school can't have a separate policy. There's now one board for the city that approves expulsions.
I'm going to leave that to John, but
John?
in general, that's the thinking.
John?
I think one thing that is misunderstood, and Andre said it so well, is that the politics of schooling in New Orleans don't feel nearly so divisive to us who are in the discussion trying to work out these problems as they might to people writing in the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal. Instead, it feels like Republicans and Democrats in Baton Rouge and New Orleans and Washington working together to try to find solutions. And the most innovative thing in a way about the solutions that have been found are not the changes to schooling. We still have school buses, we still have lunch, we still have recess, we still have high school football. It's the changes to the way government oversees schools. In a way, that is the thing that looks the most different in New Orleans, because our role in government as regulators is so different. We don't tell principals which curriculum to select. We don't tell them who to hire. We don't tell them how to spend their money. What we do is guarantee equity. Equity of access for all kids to all schools. Equity of resources, financial and capital, so the low-income kids, the special needs kids, they get more money to be served in those schools. And equity of outcomes. If you can't serve our kids well, if you can't teach them to read, we're going to say it. That's not a partisan issue. That's not an ideological issue. That's just a common sense way of government overseeing schools. And it's been to the credit of Republicans, and we have a Republican governor, to Democrats. We had a Democrat governor when this process began, a fantastic Democrat senator, Mary Landrieu, who's been supportive of all of this. It's to the credit of people on both sides of the aisle that this happened.
You're nodding. You're pretty much okay with that? Let me move to Ms. York, if I may. How is it to navigate this system when you got 5 kids?
Okay, having 5 kids navigating the system, I have experience. So when I catch the latter end of my younger kid going through the system, been there, done that. It is not what you think it is. It is not perfect. It is not horrible, but it is horrible, but it's not perfect. If you don't already know what you're doing, you're liable to get lost. You are competing with other parents to find the best school to get your kid in.
How has the one app process helped or hurt?
I went to, for her?
Helped or hurt in general?
Okay, the one app process has not helped at all. It hasn't hurt. It has done nothing for me personally. I'm pretty sure it's done everything for some other parents. One app has not done anything for me. I found a great school, and I went to that school and made myself known, and luckily I got my kids in. There's nothing wrong with one app, but personally it did nothing for me.
How did you find the school, and do you like having a system where you had the choice?
Google is an amazing thing.
I find it amazing. How does it know?
I look the school up. I want to know the grades, how many kids graduate. I want to know who the teachers are.
So where did you put your youngest kid?
My youngest kid right now, she goes to Kip Believe. It's on
Kip.
Burdette in St. Charles.
Yeah.
That's 9 miles away from where I am.
But you picked it and got her in.
I picked her and got in. I mean, the school that she was attending was a C school. Kip is a B school. If I have to throw on my back, I will. But a lot of parents hunt for the best school that they can find. My child and my child's doctor wanted Morris Jeff. I wanted Morris Jeff bad. Neither one of us got it.
Yeah, so there's a lot. Victoria, tell us about why you joined Rethink as a 10-year-old and what it was like being a student in this system and getting to Brandeis.
Well, for me, Oh, Rethink. When I initially started Rethink, both of my older brothers, Rethink has become a family endeavor. Both of my older brothers were already in Rethink, and I initially was like, why would I want to spend my summer doing that?
Explain what it is.
So Rethink is a nonprofit organization that works to get the voices of youth in the rebuilding process of New Orleans schools, because truth be told, no one really knows what happens in schools but the people who are there. So that's what Rethink does, and it tries to do a lot of like policy changes. And basically, the whole idea of it is to empower youth, because it feels as though in this time that we live in, we forget that we're doing all of this for youth, but what we should really be doing is working with youth.
Did you help pick your own school? Where did you go to? How did you choose where to go to high school, and how did you get into Brandeis from there?
When it comes to high school, both of my older brothers went to Sci High, and I...
Sci Academy or Sci High?
Sci High, not
Yeah.
Sci Academy.
Okay.
And I sort of, throughout my whole educational career, I've just followed them, which worked for me. So I ended up at Sci High, which is a marvelous school, at least when I was there. I can't speak of it now because I'm not there, but when I was there, I enjoyed it. There were a lot of downsides to being at a school that had so much turnover, which is a major problem in New Orleans, especially for students, because you have to realize that when you have turnover in schools, while that's horrible for the adults who are going through it, but imagine being a kid and thinking, oh, I guess I'm not worth it for you to stay. So, which is what goes through your head when you're a youth and you're going through the system. And me at Sci High was a great experience. I was actually 4th in my class, which luckily, because I had great friends and amazing people who weren't just like, you need to get to college, who were more like, if you don't pass the AP test, I don't care, as long as you learn something. And you know what? I did, because obviously I did something, right? And obviously something happened.
Let me, if I may, open it up, because I want to make sure that we aren't hogging all the airtime here. Is there any question? Can't believe that Victoria hasn't inspired a question. Oh, yes, right there. The microphone is in front of you.
Sure. Hi, I'm Claire Jecklin, Principal of Academics at Sci High. I have
What did you say?
a question for Victoria, who I did not know
the
would be
principal of
here.
Sci High. Cool.
Yeah. Victoria, can you talk about what did really work for you in the charter system, or Mrs. Noyce, in terms of your family, your experience, Mrs. York, apologies, and just in the charter experience, what really made it work for your students, for you, Victoria, and how we're seeing that progress just in terms of the student experience?
First off, hi. Hi. But what worked for me, truthfully, when it's hard to say it, but when it comes to what worked for me, it's not really what worked in terms of the charter system, for me at least. It's in terms of the people. Because personally, a system is just that. It's a word. It's a bunch of words that we as human beings constantly put together in order to give definition to what is going on in our lives, because that's all we know how to do. And so when I look at the school system that I went through, I don't just look at the words that build it, that could create the system or the idea of what is in place, but rather the people within it. And I think what really helped me within at least the system that I was in was the teachers, and the fact that they weren't there because they were like, I get a paycheck at the end of the day, or because they were like, I have to make sure I teach to the test, but rather because they were like, I want you to learn, I care about you. And that's what helped, is knowing that someone cared about you, because that's really what education is for a student, is does anyone care enough for me to actually learn? And so it's like, thank you for actually caring, thank you for actually wanting to be there. And now I'm in college and I'm doing amazing when it comes to like writing essays and doing math and all this other stuff. Of course, there are some things that I'm like, ooh, I wish we could have caught before when I was in high school. Like right now, I'm facing a lot of learning disabilities in college that have brought me back very far. But because I went to a school that actually cared about me, that actually worked to make sure that every student actually got what they needed, I feel more prepared than I would have if I went to a school that didn't have that. But at the same time, you have to understand that like schools in general in New Orleans, it's built on a system that has a long run of not rather before and now, but rather a continuing path of not only oppression, but also courageousness and the ability to actually move forward. We live in the South. We live in a city where social justice is very big right now and before. And that's a great thing. That's a beautiful thing. We have to use that. But we also live in a system where no matter what we say, it's still a system of oppression for many people. And not just youth who are black, but youth of every race, every creed, everything. And that's the hard part. But when you go to a school that looks at you and say, just because you're black, I'm not going to criminalize you. I'm not going to look at you like you're going to do something wrong. I'm not going to act as though you're the problem. I'm going to look at the system and say, you're the problem because you're not actually working to make sure that she or he stays within the system, or better yet, improves it. And so
I can think of no better words to end it. Your words about inspirational, but it shows the complexities too and the challenges. We're out of time, but everybody on the panel, they'll be over there because I'm sure you have more questions to ask them, especially Victoria. Thank you for joining us all.